Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Muna. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. We are so pleased to have you with us today. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us. We are happy to report that we have nearly 1,000 participants registered for today's webinar, which is an indication of the level of concern about what is happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza and also the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I know that the fact that we have a dream team of international human rights lawyers here as our presenters to discuss what is happening is another important draw. We will certainly learn a lot today from them. To give you some background about PCAP, the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, it was formed to provide a presence and a voice for the Palestinian American Christian community to be in conversation with U.S. churches and U.S. Christians and other interfaith partners. At this point, I would like to invite my board colleague, Reverend Fahed Abu Akel, to share a brief interfaith prayer and lead us in a moment of silence. And when we're done, I will introduce our speakers. Thank you, Reverend Fahed.
Let us start with a moment of silence as we think and pray for the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. Let us pray. God of love, justice, mercy, and peace, thank you for the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace and for the people and organizations in America and around the world who are working for justice and peace in the Holy Land. Thank you for our speakers and for everyone attending this webinar. Some of us who survived the 1940 Nakba, when Israel was established by destroying 530 villages and towns, and by committing several massacres like Deir Yassin and Tantura and Kufr Qasim and others, and exiling by force more than 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians who are today the Palestinian refugees. On October the 7th, we grieved with Israel. But for the last 6 weeks, we have been grieving with the Palestinian people of Gaza, who are experiencing the second Nakba. We hope and pray that this webinar will move us to act against the brutal Israeli military occupation. We pray for lifting the siege of Gaza by land, air, and sea. Pray for the ceasefire now. God of mercy, our Palestinian people have been suffering for more than 100 years. And today, most of us are angry with our US government for casting our no vote at the Security Council for forcing Israel to stop their ethnic cleansing. Our Palestinian people continue to ask the following questions. How long do you want us to suffer? When our people will gain our freedom, our liberty, with justice and peace for all. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Reverend Fahed. That was really well spoken and moving. Before I introduce the speakers, I would also like to thank our many co-sponsors who helped to promote this webinar today. They are Disciples Palestine Israel Network, Chicago Faith Coalition on Middle East Policy, United Methodists for Kairos Response, Voices from the Holy Land, Fellowship of Reconciliation, Massachusetts Peace Action, Pax Christi, Massachusetts, Saint Francis and Teresa Catholic Worker, Voices for Justice in Palestine, Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, the United Church of Christ Palestine Israel Network, Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, the Green Party Peace Action Committee, the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, and Nonviolence International. So thanks to all our co-sponsors for your work in getting the word out about this webinar. And now I will introduce our speakers. We are blessed to have Craig Mokhiber, who is the former director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Craig recently publicly resigned as the director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in protest of inaction against the genocide in Gaza. We will post his full resignation letter in the chat. An international lawyer and specialist in human rights law, policy, and methodology with more than 35 years in the international human rights movement, including more than 25 years at the United Nations, he has held senior UN positions in Geneva, New York, and in the field, and has undertaken human rights missions to dozens of countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Mokhiber has served as the UN's senior human rights advisor in Palestine and in Afghanistan, led the team of human rights specialists attached to the high-level mission in Darfur, headed the Rule of Law and Democracy Unit, and served as chief of the Economic and Social Issues section, and chief of the Development and Economic and Social Issues branch at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights headquarters. He was for 5 years the chairman of the UN Task Force for Action 2, a global initiative to advance national human rights protection systems, and later chaired the UN Democracy Fund Consultative Group, the UN Working Group on Leadership, and the UN Consultative Group on Inequalities. So Craig, we are very pleased to welcome you and are really looking forward to your insights about what is happening now at the UN and what else the UN can do as well. And we are also delighted to have Jonathan Kuttab, another renowned international human rights lawyer, who is the executive director of Friends of Sabeel North America. And Sabeel is the Center for Palestinian Liberation Theology based in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Jonathan Kuttab is the co-founder of the Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq and co-founder of Nonviolence International. A well-known international human rights attorney, Jonathan practices in the US, Palestine, and Israel. He serves on the board of the Bethlehem Bible College and is president of the board of the Holy Land Trust. Jonathan was head of the legal committee negotiating the Cairo Agreement of 1994 between Israel and the PLO. After graduating with his Doctor of Jurisprudence from Virginia Law School and practicing a couple of years on Wall Street, Jonathan returned home to Palestine. Jonathan was a visiting scholar at the Osgood Law School at York University in Toronto in the fall of 2017 and is a founding director of Just Peace Advocates Movement, Pour un Paix Juste, a Canadian-based, I see there was some French mixed in there, a Canadian-based international law human rights not-for-profit organization. Jonathan is currently the executive director of the Friends of Sabeel North America and is a resident of East Jerusalem and a partner of Kuttab, Khoury, and Hanna law firm in East Jerusalem. Kuttab's articles have appeared in Middle East Institute, Arab News, Arab Center, Washington, D.C., Al Jazeera, Electronic Intifada, and others. So with that, I will pass it on to Jonathan and Craig to begin their conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mona. It's my pleasure to sort of facilitate and enter into conversation with Craig Mokhiber. It's really interesting because even though I've been involved in international law for a long time, Craig, you are actually a full-time career international civil servant. How does it feel to dedicate your entire career to be a civil servant in the international community?
Well, it doesn't feel great right now, Jonathan, as you can well imagine. We're at a moment when institutions, national and international, are failing historically to respond to the horrors that have been unfolding in Palestine, especially since October. And that's the great frustration that led me to pen the letter that's been shared in the chat there. But I do believe in public service. I do believe that there is an essential role for international institutions, for international human rights organizations, for civil society organizations to be reminding those in power of their normative obligations under international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and so on. And I say whenever I speak that my criticism of the UN in recent months is not a criticism of the entire UN. It's certainly not a criticism of independent human rights mechanisms that have been performing their duties, I think, with great integrity, of the many human rights and humanitarian workers who have been often the difference between life and death for people on the ground, and certainly not for the 130 UNRWA workers in Palestine who have been killed, most of them with their families, just in the last several weeks, killed by Israel in additional war crimes. I think we'll be talking about some others as we speak today. So I am happy to have spent 40 years in the international human rights movement, 32 years as a UN official, but deeply frustrated at the failure of those institutions today.
Well, let's put this in the proper context. I think we are observing, probably for the first time in history, an actual genocide taking place day to day in front of our eyes. We're seeing a small, tiny population of 2.3 million people, totally like fish in a barrel, being plummeted with massive bombardment, while they are cut off from water, food, medical supplies, with a huge mounting death toll upon them. And I just heard this morning an Israeli general saying they're going to need at least 2 more months of intensive fighting in order to finish phase 1 of their military operation. So they feel they can do whatever they want, and with the veto of the United States, that there is no accountability. There is no international mechanism that tells them to even stop, to even have a ceasefire. So how do we respond? Is the international community so ineffective? Are the international, tell our audience a little bit about the international machinery, the conventions, the procedures that were put in place after World War II, precisely to prevent this kind of thing from happening, to prevent and to punish those who perpetrate these activities. Whatever happened to that entire machinery?
It's interesting that you asked that question today, Jonathan, because there's this great historic irony. We're commemorating tomorrow the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was the whole cornerstone of the international human rights architecture. Correct. And today we're commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention. Both of those things were adopted in 1948, but the horrific irony is that 1948 was also the year of the Nakba, the first genocidal ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And it was the year that apartheid was adopted in South Africa. I always say that those two things you need to juxtapose to understand where we've gone wrong in the international community. Because on the one hand, with regard to apartheid in South Africa, the international community, the UN, the international institutions remain focused on human rights, on international law, on equality until apartheid fell in South Africa. But in Palestine, 30 years ago or so, that was abandoned. And in place, there was this amorphous political paradigm of the two-state solution, of the quartet, of the negotiation process, of Oslo, that was set up, that proved itself effectively to be a smokescreen behind which we've seen, 3 more decades of continued dispossession, persecution, gross violations of human rights, and ultimately genocide, because we abandoned the human rights paradigm when it came to Palestine. And I think, genocide, I mean, to speak the word of genocide, as an international human rights lawyer, and Jonathan, you'll recognize this as well, we don't easily use the terminology of genocide because it is often politically abused. It is declared in cases where it's not manifest, and it's denied in cases where it isn't. But it is impossible as a human rights lawyer to avoid a finding of genocide in the current case of what's happening in Gaza. And this was what my letter was principally about, that the international community, and the UN in particular, was not responding to the reality of genocide. It was still dealing in these vague terms of, of both sides and 2 states and so on. The crime of genocide is very clearly defined, as you know, right? It's in the UN Convention on Genocide. It sets out with great specificity the necessary elements of genocide, both the acts that constitute genocide and the necessary intent. Acts like killings and serious harm and deliberately inflicting conditions of life that are calculated to bring about the destruction of a group in whole or in part, as the convention says. I said in my departure that I have rarely seen a case in my career where there is such a clear case of genocide unfolding as what we're seeing now in Palestine. First of all, these horrific acts are being perpetrated by a state against a specific group defined by their ethnicity, which is to say, Palestinians. Several of the enumerated acts have already become manifest, like the killings. Thousands have been exterminated in Gaza in just the last few weeks. At least 7,000 children, 5,000 women, 5,000 men, at least in a matter of a few weeks. 47,000 or more also injured, and many thousands still buried under the rubble, dying of disease. This is the horrifying wholesale slaughter of an imprisoned civilian population. Remember, Gaza is a giant prison camp. We've seen whole neighborhoods razed to the ground, massive ordnance dropped on the most densely populated civilian areas, and specifically on homes, refugee camps, hospitals, ambulances, schools, UN facilities, humanitarian facilities, all kinds of civilian infrastructure. Jonathan, we have seen hundreds of multi-generation families completely exterminated, erased from the public register in a matter of a few weeks. So that's just one act in the Genocide Convention. Add to that, the act that's listed of serious harm, physical and mental, with thousands wounded, maimed, denied adequate medical care, intentionally denied food, water, medicine, shelter, subjected to these constant bombings and sniper attacks, widowed, orphaned, exposed to disease, really terrorized. But the thing that, 2 things that really strike me in the specific definition of genocide is this specific act that the convention refers to about deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I mean, think about this. Israel has interned 2.3 million civilians in Gaza, locked them in a cage, in a prison camp, what some have called a concentration camp. Most of these people are poor. Most of them are food insecure. This is before October. Most of them are children, and most of them were already refugees. It's imposed a siege on Gaza Strip since at least 2005, where it deliberately restricts food, water, sanitation, medicine, construction, free movement, all of the elements of a decent life, and periodically launches these attacks. But since October, Israel has made the siege total. It's cut off all water, food, fuel, other essentials. These are grave breaches of international law. And already 2 million people, women, children, men, have been forcibly displaced. And I have to say, the perpetrators from Israel have not been shy about, why they're doing this. They even have invented little terms like putting the population on a diet and mowing the lawn to describe this. I have never seen such a clear case of Article 2C of the Genocide Convention. But I'll say one more thing on genocide. I'm sorry to talk so much, but this point needs to be made. The most striking thing of all is the question of intent in this case. Now, the International Court of Justice has said that intent can be inferred from conduct. And of course, we've had 75 years of ethnic purges carried out by Israel, inside Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and now in Gaza. That for a court would already be compelling evidence that that's what Israel is doing also in its ethnic purge in Gaza. But beyond that, we have something I've never seen, and I've worked in the UN through several genocides in the world, Rwanda and Bosnia and Myanmar and elsewhere. In this case, because of the impunity provided principally by the United States, under which Israeli leaders have been able to operate, they actually state their genocidal intent openly, publicly, and on the record, and have been doing so since the beginning of this assault. That is rare in genocide. Normally, what you have to do is dig through dusty government archives to find evidence of genocidal intent. But here, you've got the Israeli president, the prime minister, cabinet ministers, military officials, senior military officials, think tanks associated with the government, who have openly and publicly dehumanized Palestinians, calling the people of Gaza animals, subhuman, Nazis, a cancer, ants, vermin that needs to be wiped out, declared an open intent to wipe out all of Gaza, stating an intention not to distinguish between civilians and combatants, saying there is no distinction, expressing a need to raze all of Gaza to the ground, reduce it to rubble, even the quote, to carry out another Nakba. And because I know there are a lot of people of faith, this is one of the most horrific things. The Prime Minister, Netanyahu himself, in describing to his own troops what to do in Gaza, invoked the biblical verse of Amalek. That's a verse that commands that they wipe out the entire population, that none be spared, and women, children, suckling babies, and livestock, as the quote goes. In other words, it's a command explicitly to genocide. And you add to that the issue of capacity as well. Israel has constructed for decades a powerful apparatus of repression that it is firmly entrenched in all of Israel and all of occupied Palestine, and that is being fully deployed here. So what I've said is, if you have a case where you have such a clear manifestation of all of the elements of genocide, acts and intent on the record, and the international community doesn't respond to it or reply to it or mobilize in the face of it as a genocide, the very notion of genocide, the very force of international law is at risk. The first victims are the people of Palestine, but all of us are victims because we're losing the protection of international law.
Hold on, Craig. Before we go there, I want to take one issue out of the way. Israel has claimed that the attack by Hamas on October 7 was unprovoked and barbaric, and itself constituted a war crime because it went after civilians and took civilians hostages, etc. So let us assume, for the purposes of this conversation, that Hamas, in fact, did attack Israel without provocation, that in fact it did commit human rights violations and in fact war crimes. Does that by itself allow or justify the actions of Israel, which you have described as genocidal? Let's just assume Hamas did violate international law. Does that allow Israel to do the same?
Well, first there's the question of provocation, and then there's the question of international law. And I think it would be a big stretch to say, after hundreds were killed, tortured, arrested, abused, evicted from their homes, persecuted over the course of all of this year prior to October, that the actions of resistance are unprovoked. However, it is also clear that Hamas, in its resistance against Israel, is also bound by international law. And it is obliged not to target civilians. And any of those targeting of civilians can constitute war crimes for which any Hamas perpetrator or commander should be held accountable under the rule of law, just as Israel needs to be held accountable for its war crimes as well. But the second half of the question is whether or not this gives Israel a right to do what it's doing in Gaza, and by the way, also in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. And the answer to that, as a matter of law, is clearly no. It has no such right. You will hear efforts to distract from the law by saying things like Israel has a right to defend itself, doesn't it? Well, sure, everyone has a right to defend themselves. Israel has a right to defend itself. Palestine has a right to defend itself. I have a right to defend myself. But Israel does not have a right to invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter on self-defense. This has been concluded by the International Court of Justice, because in Gaza, for example, Gaza is occupied territory. Israel is the occupying power. As a matter of law, it does not have a right to go to war against Gaza in the name of self-defense, just as a matter of international law. If Israel were to be attacked by another state, it could act to defend itself under Article 51 of the Charter. And even on during the Hamas attacks in October, it could deploy its police power in order to defend civilians and infrastructure inside of Israel. But that does not give it a right under international law to attack Gaza in a wholesale war. And wherever Israel takes military action, it is also bound by the laws of war, by international humanitarian law. It is bound by principles of international humanitarian law.
Specifically, could you mention those principles? And I know it is hard, but let us assume that Israel's contentions are correct, even though under international law they're not. They are treating this as if there was no occupation, as if this was another state that attacked them. Even then, aren't the principles of discrimination and proportionality applicable? Please explain to our audience how these two principles are being violated, even if we assume that that Israel's framework for this struggle is correct, which it is not.
Yeah, well, exactly. So where it does take military action, Israel is bound by the principles of international humanitarian law, and specifically by obligations. First, I want to repeat the obligation of protection, because as the occupying power, its main duty, its main obligation under international law is to protect the population in Gaza. You have a clear breach of that. It also, where it decides to nevertheless, oh, and by the way, that principle of protection means civilians and civilian infrastructure, and it also means those who are not actively involved in combat. But even before it takes action, it is bound by the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Regulations by the principle of precaution, which means it has to do everything that it can to avoid causing harm to protected persons and protected infrastructure. Clear breach of that, because what we've seen is a move to drop massive military ordnance all across the Gaza Strip without precaution. It is bound, as you say, by the principle of distinction. So if it does take an action because it's going after a Hamas commander or a Hamas fighter or whatever it happens to claim, it still has to distinguish between civilians or non-combatants on the one hand and combatants on the other hand, to take steps to make sure that distinction is real. You cannot say, well, there was a Hamas fighter there, so we bombed the whole building or the whole refugee camp or the whole hospital and killed all of these people. That would violate distinction, and it would violate also the additional principle by which they're bound, which is proportionality. So imagine, if you had a criminal who kidnapped somebody and then was holding them in a school full of children. And the police said, well, there's a criminal in there and he's holding a hostage in that school. So we're going to go in and we're going to bomb the school and kill all the children who are in there. That violates the principle of distinction, the principle of proportionality, the principle of protection, and the principle of precaution. And that's a very clear metaphor for what it is that Israel is doing in Gaza. It also has to respect the principle of military necessity. And that's a very hard one to prove, because the principal remedy for an occupying power, when there's armed resistance inside an occupied territory, is to end the occupation. And therefore eliminating the military necessity, because you're ending the occupation. So by any of the principles of international humanitarian law and the obligations imposed by the Geneva Conventions, including the 4th Geneva Convention on occupied populations, Israel is in breach of international law and is guilty of a whole series of war crimes.
Well, this brings up the second question which I have. And it's one that I've always been asked as a person who's involved in international human rights law. Namely, if somebody does violate international law, clearly acts contrary to international law, what mechanism is there to bring them to justice? What can be done to prevent their actions to go without consequence? I mean, the entire structure of international law that was created at the end of World War II was precisely meant to prevent those kind of atrocities from taking place. And it was ordinary people like us who pressured their governments to create the mechanisms of international law, which were beginning to develop continuously until, I think, very recently, when we saw a reduction in interest in international law, particularly the enforcement mechanisms.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, of course, one of the most challenging questions, which is framed in your question, of international law, especially international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, has always been the challenge of enforcement. Now, there are a lot of mechanisms beyond legal enforcement of criminal law that have been put in place and built up, and to which, Jonathan, I have to say you have contributed in your work in El Haq and elsewhere through the years, that do make a difference. So there is, so-called naming and shaming. There are international mechanisms that expose these violations and shine a light on what the perpetrators have done. And while that's not a jail sentence, you can believe that countries and individuals do care about that, because they invest a lot of resources in trying to oppose these international mechanisms that criticize them publicly and hold them to account. Countries care about their standing in the international community, about their trade relations, about investment opportunities, and so on. And so they fight back against the exposure that they're subjected to by these international mechanisms. But of course, when you're talking about massive war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, that is not adequate. And so there needs to be some criminal accountability for the commission of these kinds of crimes. And there are opportunities for that you say that have been built up through the years. But unfortunately, those opportunities are in trouble. So, for example, we all celebrated the establishment of the International Criminal Court, which has a statute that empowers it, that mandates it to deal with war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. Unfortunately, the International Criminal Court has been politically captured and compromised. We have seen the contradictions where the International Criminal Court, for most of its life, is focused on perpetrators from the global south, while never holding to account perpetrators from the West, for example. And we've seen even more of this contradiction in just recent years with its record-breaking, rapid response to alleged war crimes by Russia in Ukraine, immediately mobilizing to take action, and its foot dragging over a period of many years for claims that have been put to it with regard to Israeli violations in Palestine. The International Criminal Court, the Office of the Prosecutor, have been politically compromised. Now, that's not an argument to get rid of the ICC. It's an argument for all of us to do whatever we can to bring pressure to bear to get the ICC back to the rule of law, back to the mandate that it has been provided with. We know that there is political capture in the UN as well, although to their credit, the independent human rights mechanisms have not surrendered to political capture, and they've been very principled. But the political side of the House has been tamped down, to some degree silenced, by political capture, by pressure from powerful states like the US and the UK, by lobbies, pro-Israel lobbies that harass it and try to silence it as well. But let's suppose that there is a failure of action in the International Criminal Court. Let's suppose there's a failure in the UN, that the Security Council is so controlled by the US and its veto that it doesn't establish a separate tribunal to deal with Israeli crimes. The crimes we're talking about are crimes of universal jurisdiction, which means they can be prosecuted in any court anywhere. And indeed, there is an obligation on states to do so. And that means that perpetrators could be very nervous about traveling, about leaving their country, because they never know when an arrest warrant is going to result in them being arrested and prosecuted for their crime. So individual criminal responsibility remains a really important mechanism of accountability. But I want to
Okay.
just say this, Jonathan, before I stop this. These mechanisms are in trouble. Accountability is unlikely to come in the way that as soon as we need it to by these international mechanisms. And that's why accountability, ordinary people, as they did with South Africa, apartheid in South Africa, need to mobilize, organize, and bring accountability through other peaceful means, even outside of judicial action.
Okay. Now, you have said that the two major instruments of the United Nations or of the international community, the Security Council is stymied by the US veto. The International Criminal Court has been captured politically and is not doing what it needs to be doing. Individual countries can, in their own courts, bring those criminals to trial under universal jurisdiction. Now, leave that legal issue aside. What can ordinary people do to convince their own governments to act with respect to these crimes? You mentioned boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, which are ordinary people trying to get corporations, individuals, and institutions to pay an economic or a political price for their actions. Beyond that, what can we do? I mean, on this call, you have people who really care, who really are frustrated that the international mechanisms that have been created to deal with this have been hijacked, are not doing their job. What can we do to do something? Because this is really of interest to all of us. If Israel can get away with actual genocide in lifetime in front of our eyes, what is to prevent any other country in the world from totally ignoring international law and the rights of ordinary people?
Yeah, and that's the most important question. And let me say, it's not just accountability for Israel. We have a situation now where countries like the United States are actually guilty of the crime of complicity, which is listed in the Genocide Convention. And I say that because you have a United States government, which is, as the crimes are happening on the ground, is providing economic, military, political, intelligence, and diplomatic support, all the way up to and including the use of the veto to block a ceasefire so the crimes can continue. And that is legal complicity. You have institutions of the US using their influence to actually circulate war propaganda provided to them by Israel and reinforcing justifications for war crimes and dehumanization of Palestinians. That is legal complicity. So there has to be accountability also for our governments who are involved in this. But I think the first thing that people can do is they can break free from the propaganda paradigm that has been imposed on the West in large measure, that has prevented progress toward human rights in Palestine for all these decades. This is not a war between two states. This is not a war between religions by any means. This is a situation of colonial domination, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, the crime of persecution, as has been found by many international bodies, apartheid, belligerent occupation, dispossession, gross and systematic violations of human rights, and now genocide. And if you frame it according to human rights and with the goal of equality for all, you suddenly see that the action shifts. It's not about bringing occupier and occupied into a peace conference. It's not about saying both sides with oppressor and oppressed. It's about, doing what we did in South Africa. I learned a lot. I entered the international human rights movement because of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And I remember very well that what changed the position of the West, including the United States, Canada, and Europe, was pressure brought by churches. Because up until and well into the 1980s, governments like the US were supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa. And it was the churches that made it impossible for them to do that. And that was by peaceful opposition. That was by educating people. That was by boycotts and divestment and and sanctions. It was by legal action as well. Legal action has a place here, to bring cases in courts for accountability. I think the most important thing anyone could do because of that history is to join the anti-apartheid movement. Make sure that what you're doing in your church, in your civil society organization, wherever you are, is raising consciousness about and opposing the apartheid reality, standing in solidarity with Jewish, Christian, Muslim, human rights defenders, peace activists, and others who are very active in this anti-apartheid movement, because that's what's going to tip it. I think there has to be accountability in other ways as well. And the governments are one thing, but we have to make sure that our international institutions are accountable for their failings. We have to make sure that the media, including Western corporate media that had in some cases have been wholly complicit. I remember very well that in genocide tribunals of the past, both at Nuremberg and in the Rwanda tribunal, media actors were also held accountable for incitement to genocide. And we have to hold our media accountable. Companies that are providing the weapons, that are providing the technologies, that are providing support for intelligence mechanisms and so on, those companies also have to be held accountable. And that's what ordinary people can do. They can make sure that, this is not, that there is no more impunity, because the continued violations are a project of the impunity that has reigned now for decades.
Well, just to remind our readers that the development of international law did not take place because the governments wanted it. It was ordinary people who pressured their governments to sign the different conventions, to sign the different treaties, to join the different international mechanisms. And many of these countries were very reluctant. That's why the veto was created, because some of the powerful countries did not want to be restrained by international law. Do you think it is possible that after these events, we may see a new revival in interest in creating and strengthening international mechanisms and giving them some teeth and some enforceability and some recognition? Because this is not just an issue for Palestine and Palestinians. It's an issue for the whole human race. Are we going to just fall back on chaos and the rule of the jungle, and whoever is powerful enough can do what they want? Or can we create some rules and enforce them?
I think it's going to be one or the other. And I think there is a growing realization, Jonathan, by ordinary people everywhere, that these institutions have failed. They've been compromised, captured, weakened, obstructed so much that they are not performing the functions for which they were established. And that the entire international law framework of the past 75 years, established since the Second World War, is in jeopardy. And I think people do care and they want to make a change. So I think it will be one or the other. Either those mechanisms will be strengthened, supplemented, built up. I think we need to bring back the anti-apartheid mechanisms that used to be in the UN. I think we need to put a lot of pressure on the International Criminal Court to be fairer in the way that it undertakes its mandate, the prosecutor's office in particular. I think the international mechanisms have to be addressed. The Security Council is the toughest nut of all to crack. You have 5 permanent members who don't want to give up their power. Security Council is more often than not used as a mechanism to block protection rather than to mobilize protection. And the US has been doing that repeatedly, blocking protection. I think all the hope that we have, as you just said, is in civil society. I have been absolutely heartened and warmed by the principled leadership of Jewish human rights defenders who have initiated actions, for example, taking over Grand Central Station and then the Statue of Liberty. And I was moved to my core by their standing up and saying, not in our name, and in one fell swoop, stripping away the propaganda of Israel that tries to portray this as something between Jews and others. They very clearly say it is not. It is not in their name. They oppose it and they stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. That kind of solidarity can really make a difference. So we have to build up those institutions. If we lose them, if they can get away with what is happening now, if you can have genocide perpetrated in real time by a powerful Western state and with the complicity of other Western states like the US, and they are not held accountable, and they do get away with it, don't doubt this. If you don't care about Palestine, if you don't care about what's happening on the ground there, do not doubt that you are next, because these are powerful actors who will take the lesson that they can do whatever they want and not be held to account. International human rights are the only thing that stand between the abusive power of powerful states and others, and every one of us who want to speak, who want to move freely, who want to have our human rights recognized.
Well, tell me something about the other actors in the international United Nations system, as well as in the international system, who are experts like yourself, who have dedicated their life to international law, to really being citizens of the world, and how they are dealing with a situation where people are falling back into nationalism, into a narrow state-based nationalism, and do not have enough respect for international law.
Yeah, it's a challenging moment in history, and you mentioned one of the biggest ones, which is this reverting to ethno-nationalist ideas, right? I mean, this is the problem in Israel, right? It's this idea that we need to have an ethno-nationalist state, which is for one group of people and excludes the others based upon their ethnicity. We've seen the same thing in countries around the world. In Hungary, there's a huge ethno-nationalist movement in the United States, in other European countries as well. I mean, this is a real threat, because the truth is that the idea of 1948, the idea of the Universal Declaration, is just one idea among many others. The idea of equality is one idea among many others, and we are losing. The human rights idea has been descending, while these other ideas, ethno-nationalism, white supremacy, fascism, corporatism, a whole range of really destructive ideologies are ascendant and are gaining more and more adherents in countries, particularly in the West, but not only in the West. So we have to do a much better job of winning hearts and minds, as they say, back to the cause of human rights, back to the cause of equality. And I think in many ways that does start in Palestine, abandoning the old ethno-nationalist paradigm and start talking about equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, rather than, you know, two states, one set of Bantustans, and one ethnically exclusive state that continues to deny and oppress and discriminate against the indigenous population. Equality. We insist on it everywhere else. We need to insist on it here as well.
Very good. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I have not had a chance to ask Muna or somebody if there are any questions in the chat box that we have not addressed that you would like to present to Craig or myself, because I think we have covered a lot of the type of questions that may be anticipated. But if there's anybody who wants to put some questions in the Q&A box, or if you, Muna, has been monitoring it and would like to present us with a few questions before our time is up.
Yeah, okay, yes, we have until 2 o'clock, so we do have time for some good
wonderful
question. Yeah, so we still have, so but these are some of the questions I've picked up, and that you can also look in the Q&A. But someone asked, can the UN General Assembly authorize a peacekeeping force without the Security Council approval? And can any country evoke the Genocide Convention?
Okay.
Did we talk about
one
question
at a time? Let's start with the first one.
I have, yes, those are two. They're kind of related though. So anyway.
Craig.
Yeah, the General Assembly could authorize a kind of a peacekeeping operation without the Security Council. This is something that Dag Hammarskjöld already experimented with many, many decades ago. The problem is it can't impose a peacekeeping mission without the Security Council, and so it would be blocked there by the US. But from history, what we know is that sometimes it's possible for the GA to produce a mandate. For example, when the Security Council fails, states who care can then get the General Assembly to convene under the so-called Uniting for Peace resolution to act where the Security Council is unable, and it could put together some kind of a peacekeeping force, but it couldn't impose it. So in the past, some ways that you do that is you simply negotiate access for that presence in, for example, in surrounding states, So the problem with that is if you don't get it into the occupied territories where it needs to be doing protection on the ground, its value is going to be limited. It could do some things, remote monitoring and those kinds of things, but actual protection of civilians on the ground, you would probably need a Security Council mandate. That's not to say that it shouldn't be done. Whatever we can do to deploy and increase an international presence, protective presence, even in the region, is a value. So that could be considered.
Okay, and the second question, I
Can
think
any
I can
country-
answer it.
Oh, okay.
Any single country can invoke the Convention on Genocide. And if there is any problem because other countries dispute the applicability or interpretation of the convention, then it goes to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. I'm actually writing on that subject that the ICJ can be even a better mechanism for dealing with this than the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because it has not been compromised like the ICC has been. Any single country can invoke the Convention on Genocide.
That's right, because every single country in the world is a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice. But that's, of course, a state-to-state claim. It won't bring individual accountability, but it will provide a basis and actually an obligation on the part of all member states to take action in that direction. So that's definitely worthwhile.
Okay.
Well, to follow up with that question, do you see, I mean, we know that South Africa referred Israel to the International Criminal Court. Do you see any country ready to do that, to invoke the Genocide Convention?
Yes, I think that it's entirely possible. I haven't been following closely beyond the action on the ICC, who is stepping forward, which country is stepping forward, but I fully expect that will happen if there is.
Well, there were 5 states that have, in fact, asked the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but that depends on the prosecutor, and the prosecutor has already said that he is not likely to take any action. He's thinking of taking action against Hamas for violating the Genocide Convention, but not Israel, because of the principle of complementarity. Namely, if a country has a well-functioning court system, it can deal with its own violations, and only where its own courts are neither willing or able to deal with such war crimes will the ICC step in. And the current prosecutor has already said he doesn't think that Israel can be subjected to ICC jurisdiction. However, the question of the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, is very much an open question. And as I said, I'm writing an article on that soon.
Yeah, so, I think the question was about the ICJ. The ICC, very clearly, there are these 5 states who have stepped for South Africa, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Comoros, and Djibouti have stepped forward. The problem of the prosecutor remains. I think he is deeply biased, but I think that it doesn't mean that, I mean, all that proves is that that pressure does make a difference in the other direction. And I think the court has a lot to lose. I mean, frankly, I think this prosecutor should step down. I think the credibility of the court is at real risk, but there are states moving there. The question is who will step forward to bring a case in the ICJ, which of course is state to state. I think that will happen. I just don't know what states have mobilized to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, could you comment on the role Arab countries in the Middle East are or aren't, what if they are or aren't doing, and how they've been weak on their support for the Palestinian people and against genocide by Israel?
I think they have been weak. I think that, the paradigm of South Africa is always in my mind, and I think of these as the frontline states. We used to refer to the frontline states in Southern Africa in the struggle against apartheid and the important role that they played. There were states that were in that area, like Malawi, that were collaborating with the apartheid regime in South Africa for economic reasons. This was during the dictatorship of President Banda. He and his country gained a lot of wealth by being bought off by the apartheid regime to collaborate with them. Same thing has happened with a number of Arab countries in the region. The Abraham Accords, which were touted as some kind of a peace process, were not. What they was an effort to buy off the frontline states, Arab states, so that they would no longer take positions that were supportive of Palestinian liberation, so that they would normalize relations with Israel and not challenge apartheid and the other things that were happening there. I think the Abraham Accords are gone now as a result of the genocide in Gaza. Not because all of these states are, amenable to democratic pressure in their own systems, but because they do have to answer to their people. And the solidarity felt amongst people in the region with the suffering Palestinian people is undeniable. And so I think that's the end of that effort to use economic means to buy off what I refer to as the frontline states. I think those states need to do much, much more. And the Arab League has moved, the Arab ambassadors in the Security Council have moved to take principled positions in opposition to the genocide that's unfolding there. But we are nowhere near where we were in terms of solidarity between states to oppose apartheid in South Africa.
Okay, thank you. So the two more UN related questions, is Article 377A of the UN still an option to be called upon? And can the UN get around the veto of the US opposing a ceasefire? And people are talking about what are the possibilities, yes, of getting around the US veto and the possibility of reforming the Security Council. So those are some questions. I don't know what Article 377A is myself.
What is Article 377A? I mean, the resolution 377. Yeah, this
is. The person said article, but anyway, that's okay. Yeah.
Is a resolution that provides for these emergency special sessions. So I mentioned this, right? So when the Security Council fails because of the veto, as it often does, there is a resolution, this resolution that allows a state to bring the case to the General Assembly, because normally these issues of peace and security are the exclusive remit of the Security Council. But if the Security Council fails, you can use this resolution to bring action in the General Assembly, which is a democratic body with no vetoes, right? Every state has one vote there, and that's where action can take place. So yes, that is and will continue to be used in the case of Palestine whenever the Security Council blocks it. You can expect that now after the most recent veto. It is usually the case, a resumed emergency special session that allows states to take action, but the problem is that the General Assembly doesn't have enforcement power, only the Security Council does. So anything that they do is compelling, and it shows the whole world is united around these issues, except for a few outliers like the United States and Israel. And it can take important action, can establish bodies, investigations, mechanisms, all those sorts of things, but it doesn't have the enforcement power of the Security Council.
Okay, thanks. So what someone asked, can you talk about the Center for Constitutional Rights genocide lawsuit that's being brought on behalf of Palestinian Americans from Gaza?
I can, although I've just done 3 in a row. Jonathan, I don't know if you want to go first.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, go ahead.
You see, again, we have to understand the international legal system. There are national courts and there are international courts. And where there is universal jurisdiction, there is the possibility of bringing an action in your own national courts, asking either bring a case against the criminals or bring a case asking your own government to do its job, which it is not doing. So this is part of it's a legal mechanism that people in a democracy have to participate in the decision-making in their own country. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because when you're talking about the international system, you're talking about actually states, individual states. They are usually the actors in the international legal system. But in a democracy, ordinary citizens have something to do with what their state does or doesn't do. And so where the state doesn't do its job, ordinary people can try and force that state to do its job, either by protesting, by organizing, by voting people out of power, by bringing action, or by creating enough pressure internally so that their own state will do better. And on this issue, I think there is some room because especially when you're talking about a ceasefire, I think the majority of Americans would like to see a ceasefire. Certainly a majority within the Democratic Party would like to see a ceasefire. But their elected representatives do not necessarily reflect their views. So there needs to be some action by ordinary people to force the politician to do what they are supposed to do within their own national system.
Yeah, it's really important, especially in a place like the United States, because this genocide in Palestine could not occur without the active support of the United States of America.
Totally.
I'm not exaggerating when I say that this genocide is bought and paid for with US tax dollars, literally. It could not continue without the military support, the economic support, but most important, the intelligence support that's being provided, but most importantly all, the diplomatic cover and the protection that prevents the perpetrators from being held accountable, that the US is using its resources to make sure that happens. So the Center for Constitutional Rights suit is against people in the US government for the crime of complicity. Complicity under the Genocide Convention is itself a crime. And this is not just, in the Rwanda genocide, what the United States did was it sat on its hands, it did nothing. It instructed its diplomatic missions not to use the term genocide because they knew they would be compelled to act as a matter of international law if it was a genocide. That's one level of breach of its obligations. Here is a higher level breach. This is actual legal complicity because it's providing support to the genocide in real time as it's happening. And the CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, is seeking to hold them accountable for that, as they well should. I think that we have to remember that wherever we live, particularly in the West, we are a part of what's happening in the Middle East. We're a part of it, and it couldn't happen without us, without our tax dollars, without our governments, without the companies that operate inside our borders.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry, Jonathan, did you go ahead?
No, I think this may be the time to mention that a lot of the organizations that are co-sponsoring this event, from PCAP to FOSNA to the many co-sponsors that you listed, are themselves trying to be part of a mobilization on this issue. There are specific initiatives. There is the Preach Palestine, trying to urge churches during the Advent season to at least preach one sermon or give a prayer about Palestine. There is the anti-apartheid or the apartheid-free movement, calling on churches and other congregations to declare themselves to be apartheid-free and to be opposed to apartheid. So there are specific attempts by organizations to move people. The church has done some things, but largely its reaction has been tepid and not at all robust and not at all active. The Pope has spoken for a ceasefire. The heads of churches in Palestine and in the Middle East have all made very strong statements. In fact, they are canceling all celebrations during Christmas in the Holy Land. No lights, no trees, but only prayers and lamentation for the situation. So there's a lot that I think can be done to bring up this issue and to demand accountability. I mean, asking for a ceasefire is such a minimal requirement. Please stop killing people. Please allow water and food and humanitarian assistance in. I mean, Israel is killing journalists and preventing international journalists from going in. They are attacking hospitals and health facilities. This is a very serious thing that needs to be confronted. Mona, any more questions?
Oh, yes, we have lots more. Yeah. So,
for it.
yeah, thank you. Really, really dynamic, great participants in this at this webinar. Okay, someone asked, isn't the fact that Gaza has been blockaded for 16 years intentionally and denied freedom of movement, et cetera, is that a genocide in itself? Does that?
Well, it is a part of a genocide. As I say, it covers one of the acts about bringing about conditions of life designed to
Make it unlivable.
To make effectively to make it unlivable. So it's a part of that. It is an act of collective punishment. So it is also a war crime in that regard, so it violates a whole series of provisions of international law. But I think the broader context absolutely is one of genocide.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions that seem to be related to Christian Zionism, how to refute the claim that Christ will not come until Israel prevails, and how to prove that the Palestinians are the original owners of the land. So,
well,
Any
I
thoughts
think
on
I
that?
can address that. FOSNA has done a lot of work on the issue of Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is a movement that tries to use scripture, usually out of context, to justify the political actions of the state of Israel. In our experience, most Christian Zionists don't know their Bible very well and don't know the facts on the ground very well. But they're only open to arguments that are based on scripture, not based on international law or justice or, God forbid, common sense. You have to really give them arguments from scripture. And you can, because the Bible does have some very concrete things to say about Christian Zionism and about these end times prophecies that keep changing from time to time, predicting the end of the world. And again, they keep moving the goalposts as to when that is going to happen. We have a number of resources. If people are interested, and FOSNA, there is an organization called ChristianZionism.org, where we have collected a lot of the resources that are useful for people who want a biblical response to Christian Zionism. I would invite them to go to our website or to look up ChristianZionism.org, where theologians like Stephen Sizer and others have written in great detail why Christian Zionism is really biblically not a proper response to this issue.
And maybe that could be actually the subject of a future webinar or that we could co-host, because the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace also works on Christian Zionism, what works to counter that as a harmful and false theology. So we have a question. So this is probably, you probably mentioned this already, but just in because I'm sort of going back and forth between the questions and the chat and so forth. But this is something will require clarification. What difference, if any, does it make that Gaza may be considered to not be occupied, either from the date 2005 that Israel pulled out its settlements and troops, as Israel has maintained, and or from October 7th, when Israel lost control of Gaza? Could that increase the options available to the UN, or at least embolden the Security Council?
I mean, first of all, and Jonathan is one of the world's foremost experts on this. The argument that Gaza is not occupied has no legal merit. Gaza is recognized as occupied territory. First, as a matter of law, Gaza is recognized as occupied territory by the United Nations, by the International Court of Justice, by the repository of the Geneva Conventions, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross, and by the entire world, with the exception of Israel and maybe a couple of its complicit states. So first, I just want to be very clear that there is no argument. Secondly, it is not true that Israel left. What Israel did was to redeploy its forces to the perimeter of Gaza, and in fact, to reinforce its occupation more than it was before the redeployment, because it imposed what was first called a closure and is now called a siege. That means it exercises control over everything and everyone in Gaza and everything and everyone that goes in and out of Gaza. It controls the airspace, the sea, the land entries, and it has enclosed the entire Gaza Strip in a cage of 2.3 million civilians, whom every aspect of their life is controlled by Israel in the most absolute act of foreign occupation in the history of the world. So we have to not allow that. Secondly, even if you were to have some finding, which will never ever happen, that it's not occupied territory under those circumstances, that is not going to change the obligations with regard to international law. You still can't go in there and attack civilians. You still can't deny them food and medicine and housing and free movement and so on. These are war crimes, crimes against humanity, gross violations of human rights, and collectively they represent a genocide.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's very, very, very important to keep that in mind. Just because the jailers are not actually sitting inside the cell with the captives doesn't mean that these people are not in jail. The jailers still control everything that goes in and out. Their currency is still Israeli shekels. The population registry, the travel documents, all aspects of life are part of the Israeli control. But it's a very nice way to avoid responsibility. We left there, we're not in there. No, they still are very much in there. They're controlling the sky, the sea, the underwater, the cyberspace, the mail, all telephone communications, water and food going in and out, fuel going in and out, communication, all aspects of life are being controlled by Israel. So the occupation has not ended. They did redeploy. They took the 7,000 settlers out who were actually in control of 1/3 of the land of Gaza. They took the settlers out and they redeployed their forces around it. And they have a very, very strange relationship in the southern tip with Egypt. Apparently, they have an agreement with Egypt that they control what goes in and out through Egypt as well, even though that's an Egyptian border.
That's right.
I have a question for you, Craig, before our time is up, and it's very close to being up. Do you think there is still a danger that Israel might try a forced population transfer of people into the Sinai Peninsula?
Jonathan,
I
think this has been the purpose from the beginning. I think that if you look at the tactics and what Israel has actually been doing, it's clear that they're stated, what they stated in English is not the objective. What they've been stating inside their country to their own population is the objective. If their objective was to free the hostages, they wouldn't be dropping bombs on the places where the hostages are being held. So it's clearly not about the hostages. They will certainly kill some of their hostages with what they are doing. It is not to destroy Hamas. And the reason I know this is because the Israelis are not stupid. They read the same history that we do. They know that from every other situation of armed resistance, that for every Hamas person that you think you have killed, because you have children crawling out of the rubble over the dead bodies of their mothers and their sisters and their babies, that you are creating 10 resistance fighters for everyone that you kill. Israel knows this. They know how these things work. They know also that this is not a standing army. You're not going to kill it this way. What you're going to do is kill, as they have, mostly civilians. So that wasn't the purpose either. And if you watch the strategy that they've done, it's been to purge the Gaza Strip of Palestinian life, beginning in the north and working its way south. We are already more than half and close to 2/3 done with the purging of the Gaza Strip of Palestinian life. And remember, what they're destroying are all aspects of Palestinian life. They're destroying civilian infrastructure. They're destroying cultural infrastructure, churches, mosques, hospitals, schools, any place that would provide refuge for refugees. And now they're doing the same thing in the south and forcing people to go toward the beach. So you basically have a queue, a line of survivors, to the extent that there will be a large number of survivors, who will have two choices: either to stay in Gaza, which will be unlivable and die slow, excruciating deaths, or to exit through Rafah and to move into tents in the Sinai or in the diaspora, so that the purge of the Gaza Strip will be finished. Now, will they get away with it? They've already gotten away with most of it. But whether they entirely get away with it, or whether Gaza will be rebuilt and the people allowed to return to some normalcy of life, that remains to be seen. But it's not going to, we're going to be right back at this again, as long as Gaza is a cage, which is concentrating and interning 2.3 million civilians. So I think that is the intention, Jonathan, beyond a shadow of a doubt. So far, nothing has been done to stop it. Let's see what happens in the coming days to stop it. I think a lot of that is up to us.
Thank you.
So someone asked, okay, thank you, Craig and Jonathan. Someone asked, how do we fight the lies propagated by Zaka's capital, acronym looks like ZAKA, I don't know what that stands for, and spread all over the US and Europe about October 7th, namely the lies about Hamas brutality and their attack of babies and women, and the recent questions about rape of hostages too. Do you have any thoughts about that, about those?
Yeah, this organization, Zaka, is one of the organizations that has been caught spreading disinformation, which is, I assume, why the person has raised this question. And it's quite dangerous, because a lot of the disinformation that has been spread, and we've seen it a lot. I mean, you can go through story after story of efforts to distribute really destructive lies that are designed to dehumanize the Palestinians and to justify war crimes by Israel. And, it may well be, and I believe it is the case, that Hamas committed war crimes on October the 7th, including targeting civilians and holding hostages. Those things are prohibited. If you're an armed group fighting against foreign occupation, colonial domination, under international law, you have a right to fight back against the military. But you don't have a right to target civilians or to take hostages. So there's no question. But what we've seen is elaborate falsehoods that have been constructed and then distributed through Western media for the purpose of trying to dehumanize and to justify Israel's war crimes in Gaza. For example, we all heard the story of the 40 beheaded babies that turned out to be completely false. The baby in the oven that turned out to be completely false. The Hamas headquarters under the hospital that turned out to be completely false. The tying up of babies and murdering them that turned out to be completely false. These are very dangerous. These are designed to be a part of incitement to genocide as well. So I think one of the most dangerous things that's been happening is that with this pattern of misrepresentations, nevertheless, a lot of media outlets are simply taking these from sources that are proven to be unreliable and repeating them non-critically, so that they situate themselves in the consciousness of people in the West, so that they don't pressure their governments to stop what it is Israel's doing. That is also a part of incitement, and I think it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Craig has said. International law means nothing if it is not universal, if we are not willing to apply it across the board to everybody equally. If there were any crimes against humanity, if there were any war crimes, such as taking civilian hostages, etc., these are crimes and should be condemned, and those who are responsible should be tried, and there should be no impunity to anybody just because they are our side or our people. They should not be spared. On the other hand, the process has been the utter demonization of Hamas and using that as the excuse for genocide, that they are pure evil, not that they have committed evil acts, but that they themselves are pure evil, and therefore destroying them becomes a legitimate objective, and killing everybody else while we destroy them becomes almost excusable. This is, I think, what we have to fight against. I mean, I know I've worked on human rights for a long time, and to prove, for example, the crime of torture was so difficult because nobody would even accept our complaints and our allegations. We had to work very hard to build our own credibility and to build an evidentiary base to show that, in fact, torture was being used, and then to prove that torture was systematic, that it was part of the process rather than individual cases here or there. Israel wants to make allegations and for everybody to accept them, and anybody who refuses to accept them, anybody who even asks for an investigation, Netanyahu says to investigate us is pure anti-Semitism. You shouldn't investigate us. You should take our word for it, and you should allow us to do what we want. Otherwise, you are anti-Semitic. This is, I think, what we cannot allow. We can insist on international law, insist on its applicability to friend and foe alike, systematically by everybody.
Provoked by Jonathan, can I say one thing on that final line of his about these false charges of anti-Semitism? Please don't be afraid of this. We are all standing in solidarity against rising anti-Semitism around the world, which we see with the rise of these far-right groups marching in the streets and attacking our Jewish brothers and sisters. But this false charge of anti-Semitism, which undercuts the battle against anti-Semitism, is a very dirty trick, and it's not working anymore. People are not falling for it. You know, I have said that criticism of Israeli human rights violations is not anti-Semitic any more than criticizing Saudi violations is Islamophobic, or criticizing Myanmar Burmese violations as anti-Buddhist, or criticizing Indian violations as anti-Hindu. And if all of those things are true, then you can't criticize human rights violations and there's no international human rights framework, and everybody's just going to have to accept that. But if it only applies to Palestine, that if you defend Palestinian human rights, you're anti-Semitic, that's a racist proposition, because it means only Palestinians can't have their human rights defended. And you can point to the thousands of Jewish activists around the world who are standing up in solidarity with Palestinians to criticize the horrors that are being perpetrated by the state of Israel, which does not represent the Jewish people and doesn't get a pass for human rights violations, and is worthy of the condemnation of anyone who cares about equality, justice, and human rights.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Craig and Jonathan. I want to note that it's 1:57. We still have 449 people on the webinar. I don't know whether the presenters and also Reverend Alex might be able to stay till 2:15 to continue answering questions. If you can't, you can hop off. But how are you doing would that be all right with you? Yeah.
Fine for me.
Jonathan?
My throat is hurting me, but I will definitely stay.
Oh, all right. We'll get yourself some tea after, then you'll be okay. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. So we'll extend 15 minutes just because we have so many people, and this is a very dynamic audience. You can see that people are active in many respects. Okay, so someone, to follow up on the last question, someone asked if you could talk about the non-binding House resolution conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, its consequences and fallibility. So I think you addressed a lot of that already, but that's specific thing, resolution.
Craig has addressed it. I'd like to also add to it that in fact, hatred of Jews and Judaism is a vile thing that all of us should resist. All forms of discrimination and racism should be resisted. But that does not mean that you should accept Jewish supremacy claims. But that doesn't mean that you should refrain from critiquing Zionism or the state of Israel. That's a political criticism which is legitimate. You may like it, you may not like it, you may agree or disagree, but that's not the same as anti-Semitism, which is a vile hatred of Jews. And right now, we are seeing not only that, but we are also seeing a rise in anti-Palestinianism, that somehow the Palestinian flag itself or the kufiyyah become targets for hatred and for attacks, and even shooting people for speaking Arabic or wearing kufiyyahs. Now, we have seen that. So to talk about, well, what about, why don't you do enough about anti-Semitism? We need to do enough. We need to do more about hatred of any group, whether it's Palestinians or Jews. But that is totally separate from our beef with Zionism and with the state of Israel and its actions.
I think the absurdity of this action in the Congress tells you a lot, because first of all, it's a false statement. Zionism is a political ideology, which is open to criticism, like all political ideologies, presumably. And Judaism is a religion and represents a group of human beings. Zionism is an ideology that's rejected by many, many Jews, and always has been, even when it was originated before the state of Israel was created. It has been opposed by religious Jews, by progressive Jews, by human rights-focused Jews, by those who believe in equality. So to say that it is anti-Semitic, it's an absurdity. It contradicts logic. It's impossible that you can do that. The purpose is obviously to try to conflate the two, because the growing solidarity of the world with the Palestinian cause and against Palestinian suffering has made them very, very nervous. And so they're trying to silence those who would dare to challenge this particular brand of oppression. It's not going to work. Nobody's going to obey this effort to try to silence them. It is itself a double human rights violation, because it denies the humanity of the Palestinian people and says that they don't have the same rights as everybody else, and you can't criticize that. But it also denies the freedom of speech of the American people, living inside the borders of the United States. So it's a double human rights violation, but it's such an absurdity that its meaning is going to fade away, because we are all going to speak up and say, sorry, nobody's stupid enough to fall for this nonsense.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked about the possibility of this spreading to a larger war in the region. Can't find the exact question, but that was the gist of it. So,
well, we have seen some indications. There are really three sources of fear on that account. The first is in the north. I've been listening to Israeli television, and they're saying if this war ends without our dealing with Hezbollah in the north, then we have done nothing, because people will be afraid. We need to just tell all the people to leave South Lebanon. South of the Litani should be made like Gaza, should be totally, we should force everybody out. So that's one danger. The second danger is in the West Bank, where settlers are running amok, and they are actually calling for some kind of action there so that they can push Palestinians in the West Bank into Jordan and create greater conflagration. And the third, of course, is what's happening in the Arab world, in the Arab countries, surrounding Israel-Palestine, where people are totally unhappy. They see what is happening to Palestinians. They see a genocide. They see that the international community isn't doing enough. And they are worried that their own governments, their own regimes aren't doing enough to help the Palestinians. So there could be a lot of turmoil in the Arab world. We saw that after 1948. There were all sorts of coups throughout the Arab countries because of the failure of the Arab world to deal with 1948 and the Nakba. And there may be some possibilities of disruption in the Arab world as a result of what's happening in Palestine. So these are real concerns, and they are concerns for just the instability throughout the area. Although, frankly, right now, the biggest concern, our biggest concern, is the genocide taking place in Palestine and the impunity which sends a message to every dictator, to every oppressive regime, to every bully, that you can attack your neighbors with impunity, that there is nothing that can be done about it, that the international system which was created after 1948 showed itself incapable of dealing with the challenges that come up, that it become a tool for the United States and its allies, but it's not really universal standards anymore. The damage, I think, that is being done both to the international system and to the standing of the United States in the world has not been measured yet, but I think we will see it in the coming years to have been really tremendous and very impactful.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's a question about, the UN Secretary General's invocation of Article 99, and is there anything else that, and apologies if you've already addressed this, because I'm going back and forth. Is there anything else the Secretary General can do, or what would you hope that the Secretary General could do, or the General Assembly at this point? What would be the best thing to hope for? And how can we mobilize
Try and keep his job.
Yeah, do its job. Yeah, absolutely. But I also we have international people here too. I see some people I know from different countries. So how can we all mobilize to get our governments to?
Well, I mean, for the Secretary General, I have to say it's a mixed report that I would give. I mean, on the one hand, his invoking of Article 99 of the Charter in order to convene the Security Council and to try again for a ceasefire was an important act. I think it was late, but I think he was trying to judge what was the time when he had the best chance of some opportunity to do it. I think he was compelled to do it by the murder of 130 of his own staff and their families by Israel, the attack on countless UN shelters by Israel as well. So I think he really had no choice. The reality on the ground and the humanitarian imperative pushed him. And this resolution that was brought by the United Arab Emirates and the Russians was an opportunity then to do something. However, I think the problem is that the Secretary General was sticking to the old paradigm that had failed. This wasn't the convening of the Security Council around the question of genocide, for example. Now, of course, Article 99, you got to focus on international peace and security, but genocide, I think most people would agree, is relevant to international peace and security. What he didn't mention in his speech was accountability for the perpetrators at all, except for Hamas. And he didn't address the root causes, those things we've been talking about, foreign occupation, apartheid, persecution, all the things to which the Palestinians are subjected. He said that, Hamas was brutal, and he condemned them over and over again. He was appalled by them, but he refused to condemn what Israel is perpetrating. So he's back on that old paradigm where you are careful with the powerful and you are rough on the weak, and you don't address the root causes and the realities. And then, of course, he fell back on his promise of this two-state solution, which everybody knows is nothing at this stage but a smokescreen. Israel, in his presentation, was guilty of some technical violations about distinction. Hamas was guilty of, brutality and so on. So he wasn't ready to call them to task, or the states that are sponsoring them, for their participation in this genocide. And that's really not good enough. The whole UN system needs to shift to root causes if it's going to be effective. These old paradigms have failed. They will continue to fail, and dusting them off and raising them again in the context of genocide really is, for me, is unforgivable. The Security Council has lost to the American veto unless the American people, churches and others, can force the American administration to behave with a modicum of humanity, which so far they have been unwilling to do. That means the pressure from us is not strong enough, and that the pressure from other interests is still stronger on them. We have to change that. We have to change that equation. We have to change that incentive structure. I mean, if Joe Biden was willing to actually, which I believe he has done, given up his chances of winning the next election against Donald Trump in order to continue to do Israel's bidding here, that tells you that the incentive structures are pretty much skewed, and that we haven't been making enough noise on our side. So good on the Secretary General for invoking Article 99. It is far too little too late, and the whole UN needs to shift into an anti-genocide, anti-apartheid equality agenda, as we did in South Africa.
Okay, thank you. And there are also, of course, other mechanisms in the UN that are at least done a really good job documenting the human rights violations. So because there's so many activists online here who may not be aware of those resources, and maybe also mentioning the Amnesty International Human Rights Watch reports on apartheid as resources for our, our fellow activists. So Craig, maybe you could just address some of the other mechanisms that are available in the UN where people can find documentation of human rights violations.
Well, this is the good part of the UN. You have, for example, the Independent Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine, currently Francesca Albanese, who's done an absolutely outstanding and principled job. And she and her predecessors have stacked up volumes and volumes of documentation and recommendations that are totally ignored by Israel, but that are important for purposes of accountability. There is also an independent international commission of inquiry that was mandated by the Human Rights Council. That is a standing commission that's investigating the situation on the ground. It's headed by Navi Pillay, this famous South African judge, and includes a couple of other very prominent human rights experts as well. They're doing a terrific job, and they're always looking for support and collaboration as well. There have been successive commissions of inquiry that have documented the realities on the ground, in spite of very strong opposition from the US government, I should say, that has used a lot of resources to try to block any accountability for Israel and has opposed these human rights mechanisms every step of the way. They've done a great job. The international human rights community continues to be, you mentioned Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, but also B'Tselem in Israel, Israeli Human Rights Organization, all of the Palestinian human rights organizations. There is no daylight between their positions and their findings. They have been working for years to document apartheid, to document persecution, to document, the impact of gross violations of human rights on the Palestinian people. And those are all resources, I think, that we should continue to pay attention, close attention to, and to work in solidarity with. And then movements around the world. Jewish Voice for Peace has done an absolutely outstanding job in the US and in the West. Generally, a whole range of organizations here that can be partnered with as well. So yeah, the human rights side of the house, both in the UN and then more broadly internationally, has remained steadfast, and thank goodness for that. I think they've been abandoned by the political leadership, both in the international institutions and in our own countries and governments, and that just tells me that we need to push a lot harder and make a lot more noise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. Well, we are at 2:13, so I know that our presenters have been talking a long time and they probably want to take a little break. I wish we could stay on a little bit longer. I don't know whether we could ask people to push to 2:30, but probably it's not a good idea. But I will be happy to stay on till 2:30 and let people talk and whoever else can stay. But at this point, I would like to ask Reverend Alex Awad. Oh, but before we do that, though, I want to say there's some people who have questions about how they can get involved in advocacy. So if your organization is open to, and certainly Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace is open. The board itself is comprised of people who are fully or partly, Palestinian Christian American, but we have committees and we have other ways that people can get involved. We welcome everyone to be involved in PCAP, and I'm sure FOSNA is the same. And there are all of our co-sponsors too are wonderful organizations. So you can have a look at their websites too and see how you can get involved as well. So anyway, at this point, I will ask Reverend Alex to give us a closing prayer to inspire us to go forward.
Sure.
No.
Let's go to God in prayer. O Lord, maker of the universe and ruler over all the earth and all the people who live on this planet, we come to you with heavy hearts as we see the death and injury of thousands in Gaza and hundreds in the West Bank. Lord, we, the community of those who wish to stand in solidarity with the dying, the injured, the bereaved, the hungry, the homeless, come before your presence, feeling the pain of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. And we pray for the protection and release of all the Israeli hostages. We come, Lord, confessing our weakness and our inability to stop the genocide that is going on. We come humbly seeking your divine intervention, especially on behalf of the infants, the children, and the women of Gaza. Lord, we pray that you will have mercy on all who are suffering. In the coming days and weeks, protect those who can't protect themselves from the onslaught of the powerful. O God, provide food for the hungry, provide fresh water for the thirsty, provide medical care for the sick and injured, provide shelter and security for the homeless, provide the bereaved with your comforting presence. Give those who provide aid, shelter, and medicine, wisdom and strength to do their jobs. Mighty God, put a stop to the arrogance, the hypocrisy, and cruelty of those who are committing these atrocities. And grant, Lord, that Gaza and the West Bank will soon see a new season without fighting, destruction, starvation, and disease. We come to you seeking your face because you are the God of all mercy and compassion, and to you belongs the glory forever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Alex. And thank you to our presenters, to Craig Mokhiber and Jonathan Kuttab, and to FOSNA, and to my partner, Jesse. I wanted to thank Jesse very much, and to our co-sponsor, Jesse Wheeler, who is the FOSNA operations and outreach manager, I think. Jesse, if you want to say hello, just pop in. It's up to you if you're there. I think
Hi, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and to everyone who's attended. I would be happy. I don't know, Jesse, are you okay? Are you open to staying until 2:30? Just in case people want to have any discussion. We don't usually have hundreds of people from around the world, so available. So up to you. Jesse?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Craig and Jonathan, you're welcome to stay, or we absolutely will finish at 2:30, I promise. So if does anybody want to speak at this point from another organization or ask a question? We still have lots of questions, so does anyone have their hand raised, Jesse?
Oh, yes, apologies. I have to approve individuals. So if you want to call someone, I can, because it's the webinar format.
Oh,
So
yes,
if you
we're
find
not-
someone, I can
we're
allow
used
them
to
to
the
speak.
other
Yeah.
format. Let's see if someone asked a question about people from Gaza trying to leave and Israel vetting the list. So I don't know what the status is about the border situation, but we know obviously that people who leave might not be able to come back home, right? Is that the case? You want to, one of you answer that?
And that's absolutely am I muted? That's absolutely the case. I mean, it is still the case that nobody leaves without the blessing of the occupying power of Israel. And we see that there are mass roundups of Palestinians, who are not enthusiastic about subjecting themselves to review by Israel. Most recently, Palestinian men have been subjected to mass roundups, stripped, and then carted off to places unknown. And there's great concern for their well-being because of the tradition of Israeli beatings and torture in custody. Everyone's life continues to be completely controlled. And yes, it is also the case that there is a fear by those that if they do have an opportunity to leave, they won't be allowed back in, which is also a pattern that has existed for decades, and a gradual kind of purging of Palestinians from Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Did we comment on the West Bank? What's happening in the West Bank yet?
We did. Have we lost Jonathan?
I think he probably went to get water because he was thirsty. Yeah.
So the context that we were describing is one of apartheid and settler colonialism, which applies to Palestinians who are living inside Israel, Palestinians living in Jerusalem, Palestinians living on the West Bank, and Palestinians living in Gaza. So that broader context applies also to people on the West Bank. The increase in persecution over the last year of Palestinians in the West Bank, including full-scale pogroms on villages like Hawara, the purging of whole villages, ethnic purging of whole villages on the West Bank, mass arrests, attacks, shootings. This has reached a fever pitch in the West Bank as well. So while the world is focused on the genocide happening in Gaza, we are being reminded in the West Bank that this is being perpetrated against the entire Palestinian people, including persecution of Palestinians living inside the Green Line of 1948 as well. So yes, what we're talking about, I mean, the full-scale military assault on Gaza is very particular, but the persecution we're describing is not exclusive to Gaza. It's happening to Palestinians everywhere. And by the way, there's also a lot of persecution of Palestinians in the diaspora, including in countries like the United States and in Europe, where they're being singled out, not just for attacks, as we've heard, from violent bigots, but by their governments and police and others. And so we need to stand in solidarity with them also in the diaspora.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, do you want to add anything about that? About the whole picture of the state of Palestinians?
And no other than to say that we are right now in the middle of a major event. We still don't know what its consequences are. I think that Israel is probably surprised that it has gotten with it so far. And at the beginning, you see, I listened to Israeli television in Hebrew. And at the beginning, they were very clear that we only have a few weeks before the world will force us to stop. And now they say it's clear the world is not stopping us. This is our chance. We can continue and think about what to do about Hezbollah and what to do about the West Bank, because we have an opportunity, which may not come again. So we don't know. Right now, I think the main task continues to be to work for an immediate ceasefire and to work for bringing in water, food to a population that can't eat. They don't have food. Certainly in the northern half of the Gaza Strip, people are without food and without fuel and without electricity and without water, just ordinary water, and without medical supplies. This is, I think, the immediate task at hand. And then we can work out the other issues later.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Jan and Layla, are you here? Would you like to say something? You had your hands raised if you're still here. Jan? Okay. Jan, okay. Layla, are you still here?
Yes. Hi, Mona. Can you hear me?
Yes, Layla. Love. So glad you could join today. I know
Yes.
it's late for you.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating to hear both of you, John and Mr. Mokhiber. You know, a lot of us, I'm in India, in Bangalore, and especially the students' movements have been very active in the last couple of years on the BDS. And I was just wondering, given the current situation and actually the horrific war that sort of we're all watching every day and following every day, there are a lot of concerns among the young people to say that, you know, how do we also try and do a BDS on those countries that are publicly and openly supporting this war, and how do we hold those governments accountable through the BDS so that, you know, we're not just looking at Israel as the state that's the major perpetrator, but also those governments in the global north and the south who are on the side of Israel. And secondly, on a personal question, Mr. Mokhiber, I think we've all been really quite inspired by the position you took in resigning. And how did you manage to stay for so long, for so many years, given the fact that you're such a pro-justice person, and it must have been very, very frustrating for you. And then you finally did take that big step, and what made you take that step? Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Yeah.
Did you want me to go first on that? Well, I'll start with that last question first. I mean, I had the privilege for 32 years in the UN to be able to work in solidarity with human rights movements all around the world without any problem, to speak out openly on oppression and persecution, to be openly in solidarity with the victims in all of those countries and all of those continents. The only time I ever got pushback was when it was on Palestinian human rights, and that was because of the fear in the senior political leadership of pressure from powerful states like the US and the UK. And as I say, these quite abusive Israel lobby groups that attack the UN when you speak out. Up until the winter to March of this year, the UN had never tried to silence me. And so I continued to work in the UN, but they did try to silence me at that moment when I was speaking out against the atrocities in the West Bank. And I said at that time that I would not be silent. And I'd always told myself, as long as I felt I could do more good from the inside, I would stay on the inside. But if I couldn't, then I would go to the outside. And it was clear that if I was compelled to be silent about Palestine, by the way, only Palestine, I apparently was free to speak out on other situations, that it would be better for me not to be in. And so that's when I notified that I would be leaving and indicated my dissatisfaction with the trepidatious approaches of the senior political leadership in the organization, political appointees, who didn't seem to have the principle or the courage to stand up for the norms of the organization against powerful states like Israel and the United States. Up until that point, I was happy to be there. And there are a lot, you know, the engine of the United Nations is people who are workers who really care about peace and human rights and equality, and every day are fighting for that, including the 130 UNRWA workers who have been murdered by Israel in the last several weeks. And I continue to stand in solidarity with them. But it was clear to me that if I stayed on the inside, there was going to be a muzzle on me. And that wasn't a way that I would agree to work. BDS, absolutely, everywhere. I believe in boycotts. We did that for the South African anti-apartheid movement. It was very, very effective. And it should include those who are complicit in this. I note that the Israeli government, the Indian government, Layla, from where you're you're speaking has not had a very principled approach here in defending human rights. It has very close relationships with the Israeli government, including weapons contracts and tech agreements and economic agreements that seem to be affecting its position, as well as some ideological issues with the current government in India. And so pressure on India to adjust its position vis-a-vis Israel, I think, is also important.
Okay, I gave Jonathan Gross permission to speak. So Jonathan, do you have a question? Are you still here? Okay. Sorry, we have to pick, okay, he's not. Habib Ahmed, and then maybe you could be the last question, and we have quite a few more people here on the list who want to speak, but raise their hands to speak. So.
Good afternoon. This is Habib Ahmed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was so informative. And Craig, it was wonderful to listen to your reasoning. And God gave you wonderful capacity to work for humanity. And I thank you for doing this. I have a question. I'm a naturalized citizen here in America, but in New York metropolitan area, and I see even speaking the word Palestine has become a problem. Some of my friends have been demoted from their positions. Some of them have lost their jobs. Our children in school are being harassed. There is a collection for Israeli children, and if you object to that, they call you anti-Semite. It's really changing the whole scenario. This country has become like a dictatorship. All the way from president to everybody is just taking the side of Israel. What is going on? If you can just shed some light on that.
Yeah, this is an unprecedented campaign of censorship and persecution of human rights defenders in the United States and in parts of Europe and Germany. It's just as bad, for example, that we all need to push back against. They only succeed in these sorts of campaigns when we give in. And what I've been saying is that when someone tells you to lower your voice on something, you should raise your voice higher. Because if enough of us are doing it, they won't get away with this campaign of oppression. It's true that you can be punished for it. Students in the US, for example, are being persecuted for speaking out for Palestinian human rights in ways that they never have in the past. This is also true with government contractors. This is also true with anyone in the public on their jobs and so on. And if you are being directly persecuted for speaking out for Palestinian human rights in any of those ways, you should seek legal help. There is, for example, PalestineLegal.org is where you can find them. They are a wonderful organization specifically dedicated to defending people who are being persecuted in their jobs or in the university or elsewhere for speaking out for Palestinian human rights. I'm sure you can also get advice from the Center for Constitutional Rights, who, if they can't help you, can refer you for assistance. Don't surrender. Speak up, raise your voice if you're being persecuted for this. And as I said before, these false charges that, if you defend Palestinian human rights, you're an anti-Semite or a supporter of terrorism, it's nonsense. It's not fooling anybody. Don't be intimidated by that nonsense. But if there is specific action being taken against you, then definitely speak up. If you are receiving threats, I've received several death threats in recent weeks. But if you receive threats that you're actually worried about, contact law enforcement, contact the FBI for these kinds of attacks, contact your local law enforcement by all means. Don't be cowed into silence. We have to speak up. The reason that these things are happening now is because they know that the message of justice, the message of equality, the message of human rights is something that resonates with most people. And the only way to stop that message from getting through is to silence the messengers. We can't be silenced. We have to speak up. There's help out there if you're attacked, but don't lower your voice. That's my humble advice on this issue. Jonathan will know more, I suppose.
Okay. Well, we've hit the 2:30 mark. one of our participants has expressed concern for Craig and Jonathan that you've been talking for a long time. So we have gone half an hour over our time. There does seem to be a lot of people still interested, but I don't want to impose on people's time anymore. But please make sure you're on the mailing list of either, well, we have everyone's email who registered. So I think we probably should do another one of these in as soon, if possible. Would everyone be amenable to that?
Please tell them if they will get a copy of the recording of this, if they're on the mailing list, if they have registered.
Okay, they'll get a copy. Yeah.
Just jumping in, yes, it's being recorded. It's also live streamed to our Facebook page, and that will still be up. And the chat will be downloaded. I will do some edits in the chat and then compile the links, and that will go out too. So there's been a lot of questions about that. And I just wanted to say yes, the video and chat will come
Okay,
out.
all right.
There was one question I didn't write down, but basically, is there any way to sue the makers of the ammunition?
Absolutely.
Maybe then they will stop providing the ammunition, and then we'll stop the war.
Absolutely.
You want to take that, and then we're going to close up then to give everyone.
I think pursuing corporate accountability for arms manufacturers who are shipping weaponry in real time while these abuses are taking place is a worthwhile avenue. There are a lot of people who organize around issues of accountability for corporate perpetrators in these cases, and I think that will certainly be pursued in this case as well. So I think it's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Craig Mokhiber very much for joining us. I'd like to thank Jonathan Kuttab very much, and for the cooperation of FOSNA in working together so closely with PCAP on this, and all our co-sponsors who I copied all their names into the chat, so you can look them up too. Everyone who's been quite supportive. Thank you to Reverend Fahed and Reverend Alex for the prayers, and thank you to all of our participants who have been so kind in staying an extra half an hour and for being so engaged with us. And we wish you good luck in your advocacy efforts, and thank you for them. Thank you for all your efforts. So I hope everyone has a good rest of the afternoon, and we wish you peace and blessings. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Muna.
Thank you, Muna.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you for coming.